Hello and welcome back to the course of U.S. history. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson. Last time we were together, we looked at the fall of two empires, specifically the Aztec and the Inca, as those Spanish conquistadors, Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, went ravaging through their countries. Today, we're going to look at what the Spanish do in this land once they have conquered it all. So that is today's lesson. Now let's see what's up. Ruling an empire. Spain, because of its American conquests, had become the wealthiest nation in Europe. This was really a Spanish golden age. They had a lot of money coming in, and they were pretty happy about this. They liked being rich. They liked it a lot. And they wanted to keep that wealth flowing, so they had to control their lands. One way they did this is that they divided their empire at first into two large regions. We had Peru and we had New Spain. Peru is basically everything in South America, and New Spain is Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Now, they'll later divide this up further into four regions, and then for a little while, five regions. They split it up a number of ways, but we're going to keep it simple with New Spain and Peru. Now, each of these regions was governed by a viceroy. Viceroy literally means vice king, or somebody who is second in charge only to the king. So the viceroy would be appointed by the Spanish king to rule in his name, and then there would be different regional governors that had to follow the direction of the viceroy. So the viceroy was a very, very powerful person. But they had to settle their land. In order to control it, they needed to have more Spanish people inhabiting that land. So they went about this in three different ways. One is they created pueblos. Pueblos were centers of trade, and this would be where you found most of your actual Spanish settlers. People of Spanish descent would live in or near these pueblos, these trade centers, because this is where the wealth was coming from. They also had missions, however. The largest population of New Spain and Peru were Native Americans. And in order to control that territory, they had to also control their people. And one way to do so was through religion and culture, to make the natives more Spanish. And this was the mission of the missions, was to convert natives to Christianity and smooth that process. Presidios were the third way, and these are straight up military forts. Every now and again, you gotta just show the natives who's boss, send out your military, and let them do their thing. And that was the purpose of a presidio, military forts to show the might of the Spanish Empire. Now, another way that they went about controlling their population and ruling their empire was through their social class system, which was pretty rigid. New Spain and Peru both had this social class structure, which was determined by birth and by race. That is, where you were born and what race you were. Peninsulares were the highest position within this social status. They were born in Spain, appointed by the Spanish king or his representatives to specific jobs within the colonial government. For example, the viceroy was always a peninsulare. It was a personal friend of the king who came over and ruled in his name. They had the highest positions in military, highest positions in the government. And they're called peninsulares because they come from the peninsula. This is the Iberian Peninsula, is the name of the peninsula that Spain and Portugal share. And if you are from the peninsula, you are a peninsulare. Now, Creoles, if you look at this pyramid over here, are just one step below the peninsulares. They are descended from Spanish parents, but were born in New Spain. They were not born in the peninsula. Now, they usually have large land holdings. They're usually very wealthy. These are the plantation owners, the merchants. But they don't have a lot of political power. They're not the top governors. They're not the top men in the military. Those positions are being held by peninsulares who the king will know is personally loyal to him. Now, a step below them are the mestizos. Mestizos are the children of both Native Americans and Spaniards. And the mixing of these two peoples automatically lowered them or raised them in class, depending on which perspective you're coming from. Mestizos had an important role in society. They were typically farmers, craftsmen. Most of the Spanish army in the Americas were made up of mestizos down at the soldier level. So they had a valuable role in society and were not looked down upon too much unless you were Peninsulare or some of the Creoles, who tend to just have that classist look on society. Next steps down, we see our Native Americans and our African slaves. Native Americans had the lowest social status of free individuals. Beginning 50 years or so, I can't remember the exact amount of time, but a little while after the Spanish really arrive in the New World, they eventually outlaw Native American slavery, or straight up enslavement of Native Americans. We'll get to an exception in a moment. These Native Americans, however, were laborers. If they lived on Spanish lands, they were generally put into some sort of labor, but they were paid for it, paid for their work. The trick here, though, is that they weren't actually paid enough to survive. They could not feed their family on what they were paid. And indebted natives who had to borrow money to feed their family were not free to move until their debts were paid. This is how you have slavery without having slavery. They're not allowed to move until they pay their debts. They cannot pay their debts without letting their family starve. They're basically enslaved. It was a horrible system, but it was not technically slavery as it was looked upon at the time. In the technical slavery category, we have imported African slaves. Imported African slaves were considered property, and they had no rights within New Spain and Peru until the independence of those nations hundreds of years later. Next time, we're going to really delve into the Spanish missions, because this is important for us to really understand Spanish rule over Native Americans and to flesh out their relationship a little bit more. So that's coming up next time. Thank you very much for joining me today for the course of U.S. history. Farewell.